Thank you. All right, that was a good talk, that last one. That was very inspiring. I hope you were inspired. Who's going on the adventure, just out of curiosity? All right. So that was a really important piece that was just shared, and I would call that like absolute necessity for exactly what John was just saying, that without that rite of passage, without that initiation, we will not flower. And I dare say that we're all geniuses because we're born to be geniuses, because that's when our nervous system is optimized. That's all we can be. Do you know that? The message in Western society has been that we don't actually have geniuses. You know, every once in a while one is born and they're special, right? And in the Enlightenment period, they basically said that genius was the individual accomplishment. But before the Enlightenment period, genius was in nature. And that people would make a relationship with genius by building their connection with nature. People who have their genius activated are resilient people. A community built of activated people is a resilient community. Those are the building blocks. If we were really going to talk about regenerative community design, really talk about regenerating the earth, we would actually have to be looking at the map of where that stuff actually comes from. So earlier today I gave the workshop on how to activate connection truly in a measurable, repeatable way, right? The rite of passage that John was just explaining, the Vision Quest, is a stage on the life journey. In a healthy cultural system, there are multiple thresholds that people pass through. I was with a community of Nara Bushmen just a couple weeks ago in western Botswana, in the central Kalahari, I'm going to say desert, I guess, but it's one of the most productive, magical ecosystems I've ever been in. So it's funny to call it a desert when there's more animals and diversity than there is here on the coast of California, which is supposed to be like a lush, wonderful place, right? But the central Kalahari, the ecosystem hasn't crashed, right? Here, our ecosystem no longer supports us the way it supported the indigenous people who were here. But if you take a wander with a handful of Nara Bushmen for about 20 minutes, they'll gather enough food to feed 35 people with their hands and not have to hunt. And the food is delicious. And I was raised in a mentoring tradition, and I learned all the quote-unquote survival skills. In Western media, they portray survival skills as like man versus wild. You know, you have to be macho, you have to be extreme, you have to be willing to cut each other's throats, stab each other in the back, especially if it's a competition, right? And it puts out this message that relationship with nature is bitter, cold, shivery, unsafe, and it represents some kind of a struggle, right? Something you have to overcome. When you're with the San Bushmen, you get the exact opposite feeling. You never feel unsafe. You never feel competition. You never feel man versus wild. You feel people in love with every aspect of the ecosystem around them, celebrating in this childlike, wondrous way at all stages of their life, right? And all the children are nourished from birth into a community filled with mentoring. Every single person in that community is committed to the flowering of every other person in the community. That's how they live. That is their way of life. It's utterly shocking to drop in with those people for a couple of weeks and then come back to Santa Cruz. And I love Santa Cruz because I'm from New Jersey and I'm not going back there in a hurry. Okay? So I really love this place, and I'm here because I love Santa Cruz, and I love the people here, and I love what people are excited about. You know, UCSC, what's happening even right here in this room with Bioneers, right? So, but I'm telling you, it's like going from 5 dimensions back to 2. When you leave a healthy culture where everything is in place, and when the community has true metrics of genius, and everyone's activated, and all their connections are rolling, and then you get back into a place where nobody is supported to do that. Right? The problem with John's challenge, and I think, John, you'll agree, is that we can say who's going to take that adventure, but a lot of you are hesitant to raise your hand because you're thinking right now, as you should, taking inventory, who will support me? Right? Who will support me? Who will mentor me up to the moment of the send-off, and who will welcome me back and help me integrate in the most difficult part of the initiation, the return? Right? In a good culture, you'll have lots of people who prepare you for your quest and a lot of people who welcome you back. But I want to step back in age, because that particular vision quest rite of passage may be in many cultural patterns. That might be going to, right as you're leaving adolescence and getting into early adulthood, you're going to be diving into that vision quest experience. But what happens in the preschool years that is mirrored by the vision quest? What happens in the early childhood, in the middle childhood, in the teen rite of passage, initiation into adulthood that prepares you? There's many pieces we have to put back into our culture, because the thing that we are not is a culture. So as I told my group earlier, we were talking about village building. What are the structures and processes to restore healthy culture? We call it culture repair. We first have to know what culture is. And Westerners don't know what culture is, because the Western world is born every time there's a Western conquest where one nation or village is sacked by another, right? And then westernization spreads. And in history books, we call it progress, right? In the book that was prepared for a United Nations conference, or they were basically doing a talk at the UN in Geneva. It was the traditional Akwesasne Mohawk people, led by John Mohawk, delivering a unified message, which meant that 50 traditional chiefs, and each chief supported by at least 3 clan mothers, but probably as many as 5 or 7. So we're talking about unified message of probably 250 people. That message was approved by that group of people. Then it was brought to the UN in Geneva, and they gave the message, and the message was recorded and transcribed and edited just so it would read well. The content was not changed, and that message lives in a book called A Basic Call to Consciousness. And in that book, they ask the question. It's 80 pages or so, easy read, written in very simple English. It's absolutely easy to read. The question is asked, what if we were to look at westernization not as the spread of progress, but as the spread of a disease of disconnection? And I think that's a good indictment of the Western world. I've been studying resilient community strategy, what makes effective communities regenerate. I'm interested in regenerative community, not just community, because when people age out, will the children have the same benefit? If not, it's not regenerative, right? It's not sustainable. If we can create a container that creates genius in the people who are in that container, but when they age out of it, the container dies away, then we are not producing a sustainable system or a regenerative one, right? So it's a multi-layered challenge, and I'm sure you're all thinking, oh my God. But we can do it, because the beauty in culture is that it's easy to restore, because once we remember what it is, we wouldn't want anything else. So again, I was referring to this in the Village Builders Workshop. If we are actually looking for what activates this genius power in people, because I agree with Sir Ken Robinson when he talks on that one TED Talk about that we can afford nothing less than making every child a genius for the future, because that's the only way we can fairly, safely prepare them for a very fast-changing world, right? And that's where we should be focusing our attention. And the question becomes, well, how do we actually do that? We can talk about it, but how do we do it? There was a man speaking from one of the Bushman communities down in Botswana, and he said that people criticize us for the fact that we have no leaders. And when we inquired into that a bit, he said, well, basically, we are completely self-determined people. Like, nobody tells anybody what to do. And we therefore have no leaders, and we need no leaders because we all cooperate with each other and we listen to each other, and everybody's ideas are considered. But the people who have the bright idea in the moment are the ones who become the leaders for that moment, and when that fades away, then somebody else will get it. Right? So they're interesting people because when you sit with them and they get excited about something, they all start talking at the same time. And mind you, they're sitting in a circle, so we would call it a council, right? And if you grew up learning council technology, then there's a talking stick, and only one person gets to talk at a time, and we're all quiet, listening deeply as that stick slowly goes around and people talk. And so here you are sitting in a circle, and you might be setting yourself up to think that you're about to have a council. And then when something electric comes on the floor in the conversation, they all start talking at once. And nobody looks at each other like, quit talking over me, or how rude of you, or anything like that, because they're actually capable of hearing everyone at once. It's crazy. And the translator will basically say, instead of he is saying, he will say they are saying. And he'll average out the message that they're all saying. I'll say, Franz, were they all saying the same thing? He said, yeah, actually they are really all saying the same thing, except there's some variations. These women over here are emphasizing this, and like he's actually picking out the individual voices and what is unique about their voices, but they're all capable of hearing all at once, which is an indicator of something. It's an indicator of people who listen. And they are born as children to listen to nature in the most profound way, because if they don't, they will die, actually. But it's not man versus wild. Isn't that a kind of funny juxtaposition? Right? Because you might think, oh my God, how terrifying. People in the modern times in America, when they let their kids out in nature, they hover over them and try to correct them and try to prevent them from doing this and doing that. And oh my God, there's going to get a tick. Oh, a mosquito. Oh, they can't run. Don't run out of sight. No, back here, back here, back here, back here. Up, oh, you're getting dirty. Oh, and like this is the experience. The children are just like, and they're, nobody's trusting them, right? They cannot develop that connection with nature with that kind of adult scrutiny and micromanagement. As a matter of fact, it's anti-connective, and it actually destroys everything that we're working for to get them into their genius, right? And so when you're in the Kalahari and you see these children, and I was sitting there doing an interview with 5 mothers about their knowledge of bird language, because literally they're listening in deep acuity to all 3 directions at once, or 4 directions at once in 3 dimensions, right? They're listening above, they're listening in all directions around them in a complete sound field. And they're hearing the distant sounds of birds and animals, and their mind is constantly calculating meaning in the background, right? Because if they're doing that, then they're actually able to tell where the lions are long before the lions are near enough to be dangerous. They don't have guns. They don't have chain link fences with barbed wire on the top. They don't have concrete. They don't have sharp metal spears to stab the lions. They don't have hard-walled buildings to escape into, vehicles to close themselves into, nothing. And the average height of the women in this village is about 4'9". So we're not talking about big, strong, robust people. How do they keep themselves safe from depredation and lions? There's no lion mortality statistics among the Bushmen. They don't have lion problems. They don't kill lions either. If the lions get some of their cattle, because the Botswana government made the mistake of thinking that they could give Bushmen cattle and that they would take care of them, and a lesson was learned. The lions come in and kill the cattle, and then the government agents come and say, you have to do something about this. And they said, no, we're not doing anything of the kind. Why not? You must protect your cattle. That's your value. That is what we measure value in this country. If you don't have cattle, then you have no value. And they said, well, we have a problem with that. And they're like, well, what's the problem? Well, we can't really get revenge on the lions for stealing our cattle, because the lions come in and kill a kudu in our region, or maybe kill an eland Well, when we get a chance, we chase the lion off and steal the kudu back, and then we eat the kudu. So we have a treaty with them. They steal from us, we steal from them. It's fine, right? And that's a long-standing treaty. They don't know what it doesn't feel like. They can't imagine that we don't have that same capability, and they absolutely ask us the most interesting questions. They're like, what do you mean you can't do that? How do you live? And they cannot fathom that people don't raise their children to be able to do exactly the same thing, because they have linked accurately that if their children are raised with that kind of attentiveness through all their senses, relationships with all aspects of nature, that they'll actually grow into functioning human beings that have all systems go, their genius will be activated. They don't call it that. They basically tell us we don't need leaders because we are all leaders. So I work on a leadership program at the University of Vermont as a consultant, and now I'm a part of the faculty, but it's a sustainability leadership program at University of Vermont. And for 6 years, we were researching some basic questions. Okay, we have a 2-year shot with people in a mid-career professional master's degree program. Are we going to be able to turn on all these qualities of leadership in 2 years, not just talk about them, right? Because the last thing we want to do is have leadership theory and then not generate leaders out of the program. Because there's enough of that already going on, right? We can talk all day about things theoretically. But we're at a time on planet Earth where exactly what John is saying is true. Everybody must turn on their leadership qualities. So I sat with a bunch of faculty and we discussed the attributes of leadership, and then we looked at the attributes of nature connection. And they are absolutely the same. There's different terminology describing them because they're coming from 2 different angles. But what's really interesting is that if you absolutely focus on deep nature connection as a goal and you use the processes that elicit that response in the body, the person that you work with the right support, and that's key, they need the support. With the right support, that person will develop all the leadership qualities, and their genius will be turned on. So in case you didn't hear that, I should repeat it. If you effectively connect people deeply to nature and you follow the map of what that looks like, and it's not rocket science, okay? It's just a commitment to core routines. And you support them properly on their journey, they will measurably, dependably, consistently get to genius. Does that sound important? There's a lot of people out there saying, oh, well, it's impossible because, oh, she's a genius. Look what she did. She went off and started her own company, and, everybody knows she's a genius, but she got lucky, or she came from a good family, or whatever, or she was born that way. You are all born that way. He called it a birthright up there earlier. It is not just a birthright, it's a pre-wired system that as soon as you give it the right nutrients, it just activates because it wants to. It doesn't want to do anything else. There was a great researcher at Microsoft named Bill Hill who passed on a couple years back. The world lost a great visionary leader when he passed away. But Bill did all of his research on the magic of reading because he was a font technologist at Microsoft, and he was trying to solve the problem for Bill Gates, which was driving Bill Gates crazy. How come people, when they read their email, if it's longer than a paragraph, they won't read it on screen and they print it out to read it later? Who remembers those days? I certainly did that. It went with dot matrix printers too. Remember those things? No, of course you don't. Anyway, during the era of dot matrix printers and printing out long emails so that we could read them later to avoid the eye strain, that's what it was. It was eye strain. It was kind of a subconscious resistance to reading too much on the screens. And Bill Hill basically was a font specialist from Scotland who worked for Adobe and then came to Microsoft. But Bill was trying to understand what is the phenomenon of reading in the first place. Like, we all take it for granted, but he had this passionate talk that he used to give, and I think it's online somewhere. If you find it, you got to watch him. It's amazing. He talks about Did you ever stop to consider that the job of a good font is to disappear? Right? The last thing your eyes need is resistance from a font when you're reading. You don't want those letters. You don't even want to be aware of C-A-T. You know, what you want is for your subconscious mind to just flow over the pattern C-A-T, and in your mind you'll visualize a cat. Like, you won't even think, oh, a cat, now let me project a cat into my imagination. He says it doesn't do that at all. When you study how it works, you open a book, there's a little bit of kind of getting used to the feeling of reading again, but as soon as you get going, he said, if it's a well-written book and it's a good story, you'll go slamming into the back page, and you'll come flying out of it, and that world that you were living in will be gone. And you'll wonder where it went. You'll be like, oh my God, where did that whole universe go? And he says, that is extraordinary, because during that journey and that downhill sled ride of the story itself, just coming out of these symbols, right? That's why he calls it the magic of reading. Do you ever stop to consider how miraculous that is, he says, you know? And he asked the question, how is it that we can go on a journey through serial pattern recognition, a bunch of symbols that have no meaning on their own, and have this extraordinary visual experience in our mind, a sensory experience? You smell the things that are being talked about in the smells, you sweat, you feel even, aroused in different ways, afraid, sad. Every kind of system that you have in your body is activated from reading when it's well written, right? And when the font doesn't get in the way. And then he said, why are human beings capable of this? Where did that come from? And he spent all these years researching it, and he discovered that alphabets emerged in several places on the planet, but 5 really big zones that he zeroed in on, 5 different parts of the world. The alphabet emerged when hunter-gatherer nomadic lifestyle gave way to agricultural settlements with towns and cities. It was always right at that point, when the end of hunter-gatherer nomadism into agriculture. And he said that it was so interesting because the other thing that these civilizations had in common, and they were not on the same continent, a lot of them, okay, was that they used bird tracks as early symbols. And he saw that as a hint into something. And he started to investigate, and so that's how I met him, because I'm a professional tracker who, I don't just look at footprints and identify them. That's not tracking to me. That's, if pizzas were sliced in 64th slices, the ability to recognize a footprint and identify it is 1/64th of the pie. There is so much more to tracking than what we give it credit for. The Bushmen are considered the world's best trackers. And I study the phenomenon of tracking around the world. I want to know who makes the best trackers and why. Because who makes the best trackers in the world also are the most nature-connected and exactly are the same people who produce genius every single time. And what I'm saying to you is the recipe for turning on the switches of the master tracker is the same recipe for turning on genius. We know consistently how to do that. It's not hard, it's even fun. It's actually fun. Imagine that. Bill Hill says, John, when you look down on the ground, or actually he said, John, when you look down on the ground, in a Scottish accent, you don't see like a right front foot and a left front foot, do you? I'm like, well, Bill, I actually do. But that's not what you're really looking at, is it? Tell me what happens in your mind when you're following that rabbit on the sand. And I'm like, just think out loud for me. And I'm like, all right. So I start walking along these rabbit tracks. And he says, what is going on? And I'm actually saying, look, what I see, yes, okay, you're right. I am not saying, oh, left rear, left front, I'm not doing that. I'm not counting toes. I'm not doing any of those things. It's CAT. These are abstract symbols on a white sheet. And they're in a line. And Bill's just going, this is serial pattern recognition. It's just like reading, don't you see it? And I'm just like, I didn't until you said that, but that's pretty fascinating. He says, but you're telling me you don't really see the footprints as individual things, do you? And I'm like, I don't. You see the rabbit, don't you? And I'm like, yes, I actually see the rabbit. But I was afraid to tell you that because I didn't want you to think that I had like some special powers. But yes, it's easier just to look down and see the rabbit in my mind's eye. Because that's what happens when you track for a long time. You no longer see the tracks. You just start to see, but more so. You feel. the rabbit in your body. Because it is not just a visual experience. When the Bushmen are teaching their children to track, they're actually talking to them about the way the animal moves, and they're doing this while they're talking, right? And then the children are watching, and then later on you see them doing this when they're by themselves. What are they doing? They're activating the proprioceptive nervous system. They're activating the ability to turn on the actor in that child. Not the actor so they can perform on a stage, but the actor who can effectively become the rabbit. Because when you can become the rabbit, you can understand the rabbit, you can predict it. And you learn from the rabbit skills and habits that help you live more effectively in the rabbit's ecosystem, which happens to be yours too. But the brilliance of humans raised with deep nature connection is that you get one thing from the rabbit, you get something else from the eland, you get something else from the leopard, something else from the jackal, right? The children are raised to become all the different beings around them through storytelling, through tracking. Do you see where literacy comes from? This is Bill Hill's theory, and I think he's dead on. He believes the power of genius comes from fully activating all your nervous system responses within the nature connection system that you were designed to absorb. Richard Louv says in The Nature Principle, he's also the author of Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, right? And people see that as, oh gosh, I'm so glad I don't have that. Is there like a cream I can put on if I catch it, right? Nature deficit disorder is also called separation sickness. And it is it is not something that somebody else's kid has. It is absolutely, completely rampant throughout the Western world, and it always has been. It is what the Western world is. Nature disconnected by design. By design. Because when the Romans came into the village of your ancestors, they didn't come there with a sales team to try to convince you that westernization was a good idea. They didn't ask you. They didn't ask your great-great-great-grandmothers or grandfathers. They just came in and destroyed them, enslaved them, and brutalized them, and made them stop practicing culture until they became disconnected and were no longer geniuses. Took it away from your ancestors. And then made sure for a couple generations that you wouldn't remember how to get your connection back again. Westernization was the spread of disconnection. Westernization is founded on disconnection. And as I said earlier to our workshop, the Roman Empire just basically became the Walmart of exportation of disconnective practice. But the ironic thing is, the modern world is built on that foundation. No one ever saw it as a problem. They saw it as a good organizational system, something that made sense, something where it was easy to deal with resources. And now you can get your degree in civil engineering and learn all about how to work within that system. And now we call it mainstream, modern, and good. But it's actually a legacy of historic trauma that disconnects us from our land and from ourselves and from one another. And when we look at the future and we think about the meaning of sustainability, we're going to need a whole generation. How many children are on the planet today? I wish someone could actually just quote that number for me. Somebody probably knows. But I know that it's got to be in the hundreds of millions, if not the billions, of children on the earth today. If every one of those children was given the opportunity to connect with nature fully, so that all of their sensory systems were activated, that all the relationships with their ecosystem were established, and they were supported on a journey that awakened their genius, which is called mentoring, not teaching, but mentoring, then I would not worry about the future. Personally, I would go to my grave and close my eyes and smile on the way out. Right? Right now, I'm looking at the future with a little bit of concern. And I'm thinking about my children. And I'm thinking about if they ever choose to have children, but a lot of them are talking now about, well, maybe I shouldn't have children. Right? It's like people are basically feeling like there may not be a future, so I may not have children. That's not good news for me as a father, right? And if I think about the seventh unborn generation, which is not just an idea, but a cultural element, if I could feel connected to the seventh unborn generation in a way where I deeply was concerned about them as I am about my own children, and if all my neighbors also felt that way, the world would naturally right itself. Do you realize that? This is not a theory. I've gone around the world and worked with communities, worked with people, and taught them cultural mentoring, culture repair, how to design, villages based on mentoring concepts. And I'm not talking about co-located, co-housing, or any of that kind of stuff. I'm just talking about, invisible structures. Invisible structures meaning like commitments on calendars to get together and do things together, right? We call them outings or friends, whatever you call them. I'm not talking about anything complicated. We talked earlier about the simple unit of sitting around a fire with friends in your backyard, sharing food and story. It's a very connective thing. And if you looked at your life as to what's bringing connection and what's causing disconnection, and that's all you did, and you decided to eliminate the things that got rid of disconnection, which you won't be able to do if you live in Western society, but you could do your best, and then you emphasize the things that bring connection and you actually strengthen them, you'll actually restore the fabric of our culture. It's pretty much that simple. But I want to point out something else that's the elephant in the room, and that is that the historic trauma that caused the Western society to develop amnesia and become the most disconnected, active social system on the planet, that also feels that it has to sack everybody else in the meantime and continue to expand its influence, right? It's like a virus that can't stop eating the people who aren't like that, right? So the indigenous people who are still trying to hang on are still being consumed, even in this time, by this machine that cannot stop, right? It's just like self-perpetuating a disease of disconnection, right? But if you should manage to envision a world where connection is happening, disconnection is subsiding, what would you do? What would your plan be? What really connects you? What strengthens connection? And if you all had a plan, and you all just did that as families and friends and just talked about it, that would be enough to turn the tide. And in my work, I've given this map, and the map is pretty sophisticated. It has 512 categories, and it follows people from before birth to after death, because cultures always do. As I said again in the early village builders model, a healthy culture is even talking to the potential husband and wife about what it will be like to be a parent, so that they're already considering the well-being of the individual before they're even conceived. And they're looking at it from a supportive, connective point of view. Not just an educational and vocational one, but a connective one. And when you look at a healthy cultural system, you're seeing people are focusing on education and skills, so vocation, career, right? The Bushmen are doing that too, even though it looks different than us. They definitely have their educational system. They have their recreational and health and fitness things that they're doing, just like we do. And then they have connection processes, which we don't have at all. And then they have this other thing called culture, which we lost. And culture is the regulator that tells everybody how to dance with the three different processes. Connection, let's call it education, recreation, and connection. And just to give you a sense of what's missing from our culture, which I don't think should even be allowed to be called a culture. And I mean that seriously because, the word culture basically translates as a process of connection. So if our society specializes in disconnective practice and that everything about the momentum of our social systems and structures is disconnected at every turn and every stage of life, I don't think it deserves the word culture. I think that would be like unfair to the people who actually have culture. You know what I'm saying? Because if we compare what we're doing to where cultures are really connecting people, and we're not, I don't think we should use that word for us. I think we should call ourselves a society, and I think we should set the goal for ourselves that we will be a culture one day. What do you think? But when we've successfully brought ourselves back into culture, we'll know how to regulate. education, vocation, career, recreation, health and fitness. These are two huge multi-trillion-dollar sectors of our society, right? Globally. How much money do we spend on researching connection and how to heal lost connection? Have you ever heard anyone even talk about it? When I went to school and started majoring in this, my parents asked me, what are you going to do with it? And then when I would get passionate about it at family reunions, my uncle would say, Jonathan, why the hell would anyone want to do that? Right? Just to get an idea, right? And then he would say, you're a smart young man. You know, your mother's worried about you. You're not going to be able to take care of your family. Why? Because there's no job in the Department of Culture. There is no Department of Connection. There is no Minister for Connection in the government level. There's no office in Santa Cruz to restore connection and heal broken connections from historic trauma for the last 500 years. Nobody's working on this. But you know where we are working on it? In every aspect of our society, because disconnection disorders are rampant. Rampant. Nature deficit disorder, autism, never mind all the drug addiction and all of the problems of homelessness and everything else that is plaguing us and we're spending millions and billions of dollars on. These are all curable through connection. If we focused on restoring connection to our world, we would truly have a chance at the future. So I hope you can get a sense of that. When I was going to say the thing that's missing, when I'm with the Bushmen and I'm looking at the different processes, connection process, educational process, recreation process, in my upbringing, everybody was driving this one. About 80% of everyone's energy was all about career, education. You got to make something of yourself, right? About 20% was outdoor recreation or games or football or sports, right? But when one of my relatives became an outdoor rec major, you know, that was great at the family reunion, you know? But he got better marks than I did, right? Oh, you're an outdoor rec major, huh? Great. Sounds like a good journey, Joe. You know, well, 20 years later, Joe was the only one who could still walk. All the rest of them were hobbling around. They were all they hated their life. But Joe was always tan. He looked about 25 years younger than everyone else, you know. What's wrong? How come you're not aging? Right? I should have done outdoor recreation. I was making fun of you all those years. But then when they don't even know what to do with me, because I'm an invisible structure specialist, right? And but there's a pattern here. You see how our culture values things, right? Everybody at the family reunion loves you if you have a great career and an educational path. They kind of put up with you and kind of get a funny look on their face when you go into recreation or recreation-related stuff, right? But if you go into cultural process facilitation to help restore the invisible structures, they don't even know what to do. They don't even know how to react to you. But look at the percentage of investment in our society, right? Where do we put the emphasis? How many geniuses do we get? 1 out of 100,000, if we're lucky. Now go to the Bushmen. How many geniuses do they get? When their culture is left alone and they're not being oppressed and colonized, they get 100% genius because they have to, because they can't afford any drag on the system, because they have to move like a totally smooth operating system to live in the Kalahari and not die. You see? Keep the mortality statistics low, the insurance rates down. You don't want to have kids getting eaten all the time. It doesn't play well with the insurance adjusters. So they developed a thing called culture, which regulates a third process, which is all but missing from our community, and that is connection. And now if you look at what they prioritize on those 3 quadrants, right? Education, recreation, connection, I would say they're probably 60 to 80% connection oriented, and then education is much easier. When I do educational consulting with schools, and I work with schools at all levels, I say, you focus on connection and your education is going to rise. Because when somebody's connected, they have a set of attributes. These are the metrics for connection. You ready? They're happy as a child. They're vital. They have an abundance of electricity in their body. Those two right there make better educated functionality right there. If you're happy and electric, you're going to do better in school. And we know that because we see people's grades rise when we focus on connection. The third one, you have the ability, the commitment, and the capacity to listen to other stories without interrupting and without projecting your thoughts onto them. You actually listen to people. It's almost gone in Western society. Nobody knows how to listen to each other, and the reason that's so is because no one listened to us when we were little. And even if you go into a classroom, I love going into third grade classrooms because I say, oh, here, I'm in here today to talk to all you guys about nature. Oh! All their hands go, oh. You know, if I was an anthropologist from another race of beings from outer space and I landed on the earth and I went into one of the classrooms and I saw the children doing that and I couldn't understand the sounds or where I was standing, I would say that they were really constipated. I would be looking at them like, they're really uncomfortable. There's something really uncomfortable in those children, but we don't even think about it that way, but they are absolutely longing for someone to catch their story. When I walk in the room, they know that I can catch stories. They can just feel it because their little fields are like looking for story catchers. In a healthy. And if they can't listen in that moment, they'll be like so disappointed and they'll be like, oh, I want to listen to your story, but I can't right now. Please tell me your story later. Right? In our society, we don't even have those kinds of opportunities. We have intersecting monologues. People talk at each other. They semi-listen to each other, mostly to hear the space so they can cut in. Right? And I grew up in a place where intersecting monologues that was the only thing I could look forward to in social settings, right? Then I'd drop in with the indigenous people, and then I'd see what listening could feel like. And it was so frustrating to go back into modern people, postmodern people who don't even know that listening is possible. That's an important attribute, don't you think? The ability to listen to each other. If we listen to each other, we afford the other the opportunity to make connections for themselves, and their connection system increases in power. If I have an experience in nature and I can't tell somebody about it who really listens, I will not maintain that connection. And it's not just about short-term, long-term memory storage either. There's something in what Bill Hill's saying about the need for us to be fully in our bodies when we tell our stories. Our brain is wired that way. You know, human beings existed for now, I think, 2.7 million years, at least people aren't arguing over about. So for 2.7 million, we've been humans. And for 2.699 something, Western society has been around, right? And we think we invented a few things that make us smart. But the operating system, the human operating system that is designed in a certain way is fed from nature because that is what it's designed for. You give it the nutrients it needs, and out come these attributes, sometimes called genius, sometimes called leadership. I call it quality of life, personally, and I think everyone needs it. I think everyone should have it, right? So we've got happiness, we've got vitality, we've got the ability to listen deeply to each other. The fourth one is empathy itself. Empathy sound like a good idea in the neighborhood? Anyone from Santa Cruz want more empathy in our neighbors? I do. As a matter of fact, I want all these attributes in everyone in Santa Cruz by the end of the year. All right, number 5, if I have empathy truly in my body, then I will have an innate, unstoppable desire to make a difference for the future generations. Okay? I will want to help my people live. And it won't be an ideology, it will be a drive, a calling, and there's a difference. That's where leadership comes from. The 6th one, I'll be fully alive along the way. I'll know that I'm a mortal being and I don't get to be here forever, and so I'm going to be as happy and healthy and loving as I can be and experience and give my all to everything I do. And this is just what the Bushmen are like. This is who they are. The last one is you'll have a loving, forgiving, compassionate heart. Again, good qualities for our neighbors in Santa Cruz. And last but not least, you'll have that quiet mind without having to hire a meditation teacher, because you will be completely connected through your sensory process to all that's around you, and you won't need to meditate. You won't even need a mantra, except for this one. The old Bushman would say, is the oldest man in the village. He comes to the children and he tells them the same story. He tells them over and over and over again. But you know how kids are. They like that, right? You ever have a kid that wants to read the same book over and over and over? I'm like, I'm so tired of reading that book, but if that's what they want, I'm going to read it. The reason they want the same story over and over again is because they're hardwired for that. Because it used to be that elders like this man would drop these kinds of stories into your ear. You ready? Longest story I've ever heard. A long time ago, the lions ate a lot of us Bushmen. And he smiles, and he has his hands like this, lovingly. No creepy Hollywood soundtrack with it or anything like that. He doesn't try to scare them or make them creep out. He actually says it with all this love and a big smile. And then he pauses and he says, they ate a lot of us. He just smiles, and that's it. That's the story, beginning, middle, and end. And the children, they just sit there like stock still, and they just kind of sink down into their bodies, and their eyes go up to the right. Mouths are slightly open. But you know what's interesting about Bushman children? I had 19 of them around me, and 5 mothers. And when you listen to the field recordings of those conversations, you don't hear children at all, which is nearly impossible. Did you notice? Like, we just have 3 children here, and we're aware of them the whole time. But when you're with them, you don't hear them at all. Nobody's disciplining them. They're just getting that story told to them over and over again. I swear, that's what they're doing. I cannot find any other evidence that they're doing anything else. I've looked. It's just amazing. But let me say one thing, because I got to let you go. A bird alarm goes off over there, like 50 yards away, indicating a mongoose is moving on a landscape, right? 19 little heads go like this. Just like that. I would love to see children do that here. For any little bird alarm. That means they're wired. That means they're going to be geniuses. But if you want it to matter to them, you got to catch their stories about the bird language. Because if you model what's important, they'll let those connections form. So we have a layered problem to solve here, my friends. But we're not giving up. And it's going to work. All right. Thank you. Good. Onward and upward.